Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Books, the Hidden Gems author podcast, which Craig Touch, myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and self-publishing. And before we begin, just remember that if you are a self-published author looking for help with your covers, blurbs, editing or advertising, we have a whole suite of services that we offer which can help. So there's a link in the description down below. Go there if you're interested. But let's get back to the show. We are delighted today to welcome a very special guest, Randi-Lee Bowslaugh, who's an author, speaker, mental health advocate, and all-around awesome. That's official. It's been certified. So how are you doing today, Randy?
I'm good. How are you?
I am very well. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Perfect. Thanks, Roland. Thanks for coming on today, Randi-Lee. I know that what we want to talk today about is, you write in the nonfiction genre, and well, it's a lot of nonfiction. A lot of it is, there's lots of it, but self-help books and stuff like that, right? So people read these to help with their own personal journeys. But it's not only self-help, like all sorts of books, specifically nonfiction, even fiction, can help people in their lives with whatever they're going through, right? So we want to sort of talk today about that. And also, the idea of understanding for an author to really understand the concept, the purpose behind their book. And often to do that, you have to understand your audience and your genre and everything that goes into that. So let's start off by talking about a little bit about you and what you write and your journey, what brought you here, and then we'll go from there.
All right. What do you want to know? There's a lot.
Well, how'd you get started as an author? I'm not talking about birth here, right?
Well, So as an author, I published my first book in 2017, and it was actually a collection of poetry that I wrote as a teenager that was in my basement, just collected dust. So one of our grandparents had died, and I don't remember which one at the time, but we were cleaning the basement, and I came across them and went, oh, these are actually not bad. I don't want to throw them out, but they're just sitting here. And that's when I said, I always said I was going to write a book. There we go. I'm going to put them together. I'm going to make it beautiful. And that's going to be my book. So that would be how I became an author, kind of weirdly. But writing, really, I've been writing forever. I used to write a household newspaper and make my mom read it because she was so interested in what she was cooking for dinner. And then, of course, as a teenager, like I said, I wrote poetry. I used to write plays and make my cousins act them out with me. So it's just always been a part of me to do writing. And then 2017 was the first experience publishing a book, and then I went, this is amazing, and I just kept doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. This just in spaghetti and meatballs for the third night in a row.
Right? She was very interested about it.
So all of your writing then has been in the nonfiction sort of area?
Not all of it. I would say 90% of it. So I do have a couple of kids' books that border on nonfiction because the stories do kind of relate to things that have happened in life, but I've definitely made them different, being for kids. And then I do have a collection of short, scary stories. So that deviates drastically from nonfiction. They are nowhere near anything truthful.
Well, we hope.
Yeah.
Oh, they're not. They're all monsters. So they better not be, because that'd be scary.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk then about what you write in the nonfiction genre, and sort of what's your overall purpose of writing these things.
So the biggest purpose is to make sure that other people don't feel alone. So most of what I write is about mental health, or autism. So my kid was diagnosed with autism at age 8. I got diagnosed in my 30s. So it is also a very big part of our lives. So most of what I write is around that mental health category or autism. So when I was going through my worst of the depression, the worst feeling is feeling all by yourself. And so my purpose is to make sure other people don't feel all by themselves. And that is what I hope they get out of the book when they read any of them and go, oh, other people have experienced something similar. I'm not the only one.
It's funny. My eldest kid is on the spectrum as well, and he is a passionate writer at 16 years old. And I think it's part of that. It's like part of it is you see yourself recognized in the creative stuff that other people do.
Yes.
And it's funny too, because that's just also the same with my older son. He's also on the spectrum, although he's not interested in writing. But I definitely get that sort of feeling where when you're going through these things, especially if you don't have personal connections with other people that are going through it, then yeah, you definitely have that feeling that you're the only one going through it. You're alone, right? And even though you know that that's not true, you always sort of internalize these things to be much more dramatic to because it's your own experience, right? And so I can see, and those things are cathartic as an author to write about your personal experiences, but then it also helps others. So I think it's got a lot of benefit, even if it's not necessarily giving them even information that they don't sort of already know. It's that idea that other people are going through.
Yes. Connection.
Absolutely. So what do you think, I guess when you're writing this stuff, what is your goal? Is it to, I guess, really, is it to just to make that connection, or are you trying to give advice and to,
Yeah, the biggest thing is the connection, making that connection. I don't like to give advice because I also never like to receive advice because people love to tell you what to do. Yeah. But I do share my wisdom. That's what I like to call it. Because it's take it or leave it. This is how I write it. This is what I've been through, the things that I did that did not work at all. And I wish I wouldn't have wasted my time. But here's the things that did work. So hopefully you will learn from my mistakes and just jump to the things that worked instead of, spinning your wheels trying to figure it out. I'm hopefully giving that life experience, kind of like the parent that always says, when I was a kid, I tried that too. And it's not good for you. But as a kid, you still do it anyways because you don't listen to your parents. But that's kind of the idea is I've been through all of these different things. So yes, I've made the connection with the person and hopefully they will glean something out of it. A couple of my books, they even have like worksheets at the end of them because they're things that I've learned, especially when it comes to raising a kid with autism. And you go to all the doctor's appointments and they all ask you the same set of questions and you have to give the same answer 20 different times. So there's things that I've learned that I'm like, hey, if you just start keeping notes of this stuff now, it's a lot easier to photocopy and hand them the pages than to try and think on the fly and go, oh yeah, when did they start holding a spoon? I don't know.
I never even thought about that, but you're right. Those are questions you get asked a lot, and they just all these small details fly by. I probably couldn't tell you what I had for dinner last night.
Exactly. So I've put some of that kind of stuff at the end that I've learned because I've had to go through it all. So hopefully somebody who's just starting the journey can use it and not have to pull their hair out because they're trying to remember a million things to tell 10 different doctors.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like when you're writing something in the nonfiction genre, that goes back to that idea of understanding your audience and understanding, what it is they're trying to get out of this book and where they are in their journey, right? So if they're reading a book about autism and it's geared towards, sort of like the person who is new to the idea, then having that kind of information, worksheets, checklist, to-do items, here's things that you need to, because by the time people ask for them, it's too late. Like you haven't been keeping track, right? So you read all that stuff and you see what it is you need to know, and not just a whole load of advice, but like practical information that can be used. And I think that's a really, really key thing that I think in this genre specifically, you really, really need to give people. That's what they're looking for, I think.
Exactly. I always say that we're living through part 2 of what will be that book. And the audience ideally will have grown with us because hopefully they've read the first one. But the audience for the second one would be parents that have been through it for a while now, because now I'm talking about the teenage years. So knowing the audience, because it can change with what the message of the book is. So you kind of have to keep that in mind, because I don't need to write those same worksheets in a book that's about raising the teenager with autism, because you would have already went through all that stuff when they were diagnosed when they were little.
Right. Although, I mean, sometimes you get diagnosed late too, right?
I'm in my 30s, so.
I didn't know I had ADHD or ADD at least until I was maybe in my 30s. I mean, I kind of suspected, but I never got formally, diagnosed, and it certainly would have helped if I knew that earlier. Would have explained a lot, at least. Yeah.
I think Craig probably diagnosed me.
I diagnosed a lot of people with a lot of things.
At least it's not Dr. Google.
No, it's more I have my BA in psychology, so clearly I know everything. So I think that's really key to this, John, is understanding your audience, understanding and not just understanding them, but understanding the point they are in their journey. Because, like you said, you can write your book based on where they are in their journey. It's not just like, I'm going to write a book about autism. You want to be like, I want to write a book about, the issues about first diagnosis of when they're young. I want to write about the teenage autism experience. I want to write about the adult autism experience. Maybe you want to write about, how to support somebody in the workplace that has autism. Like, you be very, very specific, and that really is informed by who you think your audience is. So how do you decide, is that what goes into when you're planning the book? Are you thinking about who your audience is, or?
I'm not a super planner. I think that comes from my autism. I like to just jump in, and I see the more bigger picture than all of these little plotting and planning things. So I often will just have my little purpose first of going, I want you to feel not by yourself. Well, and then I just start writing my story. And as I'm going, that's usually when it figures itself out. It figures out that because I'm sharing this part of my story, it makes sense that I'm talking to new parents. So, okay, now that I know that, as I go through and edit the second version, then I have that more in mind. But I would say the first draft is more laying out the structure of the purpose of it. And then my second run through of it is more fine-tuning for the specific audience.
That's great advice. I was just thinking Neil Gaiman. I know we don't talk about Neil Gaiman now because he's persona non grata, but he always said, I think that the first draft of your story is you telling it to yourself, and then you have to figure out how to tell it to your audience.
Huh, I never heard that, but it's exactly
how I think about it.
Yeah.
So how has the feedback been that you've gotten from these books? Like, are you hearing from your audience, and are they telling you whether or not these things are helping from their journey?
Yeah, so the different reviews, I love reading the reviews, and luckily they've not hurt my feelings yet. But the reviews that I'm reading are very much, wow, this is hitting the nail on the head. My kid is just like this. Or with my most recent book, which is more of coming through a depression kind of thing, and it's poetry, but it's coming through depression. Some of the reviews are very much around how strong you can be even when you don't realize it. I'm like, wow, that's something I didn't even know I was putting into this book, but I'm so glad you got it out of this book. I just wanted to show you the resiliency of it. But I think from what I'm hearing from the reviews, reading from them, everything is hitting the nail on its head with giving the purpose and letting people know that they aren't alone, and there is, light at the end of the tunnel, so to say.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things about writing a personal journey. Like, you can write a nonfiction book on a topic that you've researched that isn't necessarily like a personal journey. Let's say you're writing about AI, right? And I use AI and I've researched AI, and that can help people with stuff, right? But when you tell this personal journey of something that you've gone through, I can totally see how other things that you didn't necessarily mean to come through will come through just because you're telling your story. And I love that people are getting that out of it.
Yeah, the one review on the book about raising my kid, she actually even said I was crying throughout parts of it. I'm like, oh, I hope they were tears of like kind of happiness, not all sad. But it made me feel so excited because I was like, I've really hit the emotional heartstrings here. So I'm so glad that this is giving to you something that maybe was missing before, because it is so hard to find your people when you're in these situations. So sometimes having a book is finding your people.
I think there's probably no more validating thing than to hear your writing actually made someone cry, unless of course it is tears of like, oh my god, this is so bad that I'm crying. But no, generally it's because you managed to pluck at a heartstring.
Yeah, I love that about writers and that connection you can make with the audience. And it's always so much more personal when they have when they can empathize with what's going on, right? I doubt, people are crying too much over, in fiction novels you can, because, you have your characters and people fall for your characters and stuff. But, you have to sort of engineer that a lot more than when you're telling that personal story. And sometimes you'll be watching something on TV and it's not even something that is meant to make you cry, but it speaks to you personally, and sometimes that makes you well up a little bit. And when you're sitting next to somebody and they're like looking at you and you're like, oh, something in my eye.
I'm not crying, you're crying.
Yeah, exactly. So have you ever written a nonfiction book about something that you aren't necessarily personally invested in? And if so, what is the experience on that, the difference?
No, I definitely stick to topics that are personal. My writing style is very much like I'm sitting down with you, we're having some coffee or tea, because I don't really drink coffee, but we're sitting down, we're having a drink, and we're just having a conversation, and I'm sharing things that have happened. That's kind of my writing style. So I do stick to more personal topics, and that way the story is honest. It's all about the honesty for me in those stories.
So what is the inspiration of the stories? You say you want to connect with someone, but obviously a story is kind of like it's a journey, really.
Yeah.
So, and you say you're a pantser, you just jump in and start writing. Do you have any idea of where you're going when you start these things off?
So there's always kind of an end game in it, and I always bring that back to it being the purpose. So once I've fulfilled that purpose, the story is over. And I try to, because I have multiple books all about my journey, but each one is about a different story in it. So I'm taking one piece. So like A Mother's Truth, I'm taking the piece of raising my kid with autism. I'm not bringing in my depression or PTSD or any of that other stuff. I'm focusing on that one storyline that's going on. And then I have, Goodbye Too Soon, which is about my brother's death by drug overdose. And again, I'm sticking straight to that story. Yeah, there might be some interconnected pieces. So if you were somebody who read all of my books, you'd be like, oh, wow, okay, yeah, so this happened. Well, that was happening because the timeline matches. But I'm not sharing the same information. I'm sticking to the purpose. This book is about my brother. This book is about my kid. This one's about my depression. Like, I'm sticking to these storylines, even though they are connected in my life. They all have a different audience. Coming back to that audience, right? They all have a different audience. So I don't want the audience to be like, oh, we just took a left turn into I don't know what. I want to stick to what it is they are hoping to get from the book and what that purpose is for that audience.
I actually think that's really, really good advice for any writer, because especially when you're starting out and you have like a complex book with a complex cast of characters, it's so easy to go in different places. And really what makes a book really digestible and really stick with you is if you have that focus. And it takes a lot of discipline to do that as well. So it sounds like you identified that, and then you can tell the same story 5 times because you're focusing on a different thing each time. And exactly. I don't think it gets repetitive. In fact, there are some authors like Stephanie Meyer with Twilight, where she writes the entire story again from a different character's viewpoint, and it's still new and entertaining because to be able to see the story through another pair of eyes gives you all sorts of new viewpoints into it.
Yeah, I've definitely read some books where I'm like, oh, I wonder what happened with that character. I want that one now. So it definitely has a place and different audiences for it.
And so I was going to ask, oh, Craig, you look like you're just about to jump in. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was just having a look at some of the books, and when I was thinking about when we were talking about them, I was thinking that they're sort of more, even though you said you're trying not to give advice, like I'm still thinking of them as sort of more written as more, I guess, self-helpy kind of things. But then when you're talking about them, I realized that, and then I looked to make sure, like you've written them more as stories, right? Like these are almost like read like novels almost, but they're giving your perspective, and people are still reading them specifically to as a self-help. Like it's not like, it's funny, I was reading one of Roland's blog articles, and he was talking about how writers write for political change and for various things, right? And so often you're using your story as an allegory for whatever, right? So like Animal Farm, so it's a story that's like, you've got to read into it to sort of understand what the purposes. But with your story, you're telling specifically about it. Like it's very clear. You're not trying to like, disguise what you're talking about, but it's not written in a self-help or like traditional nonfiction kind of way. It's written more as like a biography. And then when you go back to that idea of being able to focus the same story, your same journey, but be able to write those same stories in a way that that would speak to a different audience each time. I think that's really an amazing idea. It's like you can tell your personal story, even the same events, but the way you focus it could hit a different audience. So I think that's really.
I was going to ask, who are some of the writers and books that have really inspired you? Because that was what triggered my son writing in the first place. Was he'd watch Evangelion, the anime, and he'd read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and his ideas would come from all of these things, and he'd smush them together into something new. So what were some of the things that inspired you?
So it's actually funny because since I write a lot of nonfiction, I don't read a lot of nonfiction. It's not my favorite genre to read. So some of the first books that I ever read, my mom got from like the Avondale, and it was just Stephen King books. And because I love horror. So, as a teenager, I'm getting these books, and the school is saying, hey, read this one, read what are they? I can't even think of what they're called now. Anyways, you're reading these novels at school and Shakespeare and stuff. I'm like, oh my gosh, I hate reading. And then my mom comes home with a horror book, and I'm like, oh, I love reading. So that definitely inspired me to read more. But again, I don't read a lot. So now I just read what people give me. So I do a lot of book reviews. So I read everything. But I would say what really inspired me way back when, Stephen King was a really big one, because I just love horror, and I just love that there was constant new stuff from it. And I liked at like going back into my younger years, there was this book called Time Cat, and I love cats. So it was about this cat that could travel, like you have 9 lives as a cat, but these 9 lives just meant that you traveled to different time zones, like throughout history. So that was really a fun one. And there was another book that always stuck out to me as a kid, and it's called Cloning Miranda. And it was about a young girl who had some kind of illness. I can't remember exactly because I'm going back a while, but her parents cloned her so that they had somebody to basically take parts from to fix their daughter. And so these books just stood out to me because I really enjoyed reading them. And so when I'm writing, I'm just inspired to make sure I'm writing a book that somebody enjoys reading. I don't want it to just be facts. I don't want it to be boring. I want it to have a fun purpose at the end. Even if it's nonfiction and about a heavy topic, I still want that to be something somebody wants to keep reading and not put down. And because that's what I like. I like books that I pick up and I just want to keep reading.
Yeah, Chloe Miranda is an interesting one because that predated Jodi Picoult's My Sister's Keeper, which is all about parents who had a kid with really bad diseases. They had another kid so they could actually like use her for blood transfusions and stem cells and stuff like that. And it's interesting that book got written after Chloe Miranda. So maybe Chloe Miranda like inspired that. Maybe.
I just remember doing it. And I remember in school, probably grade 6 or 7, something like that. And I read it as doing a book report. So I loved the book. So I'm like, I'm going to reread it and do a book report, and I had to make a diorama of the one scene. And I made it have like the little moving parts and everything. So that book always stuck with me.
I think you're so right about how school, they want us to read books. So they force us to read books. But for a lot of kids, it just turns them off books completely. And I remember I went through a stage because I grew up in England. So the books that we read in school in England, we don't read are different to the American ones. So when I moved to America, I was like, I'll read Catcher in the Rye and The Great Gatsby and all the books you had to read. But it was kind of nice because my son read The Great Gatsby, and then he and I could talk about it, and it creates that connection. And as you were saying earlier, like everything you do about writing is to make a connection and make people not feel alone. And there we go.
Yeah, books are fabulous because they also there's just some books that stand the test of time, right? Like The Great Gatsby, and you generations can read it, and then you make those connections, and you can talk about them and continue loving the same book for years and years and years.
Yeah, it makes sense too when you say like you don't read a lot of the nonfiction, you read fiction, and so of course your books are going to be written like stories, and I do like that idea because it does pull people in more. I see what you're saying. When you have a book full of facts, and this is a learning book, then it's like people have that mental block, right? It's like, oh, school.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't want to learn anymore. I've finished school. Yeah, I had that same thing with my kids. Is like my son reads just constantly. That's all he does now. He just stays in his room and reads. But it wasn't until he found the kind of book that he liked, and for him it's like all of it's fantasy, it's dragons, it's all that kind of thing.
My husband too.
Yeah, and me too. Like when I was young, those are the books that started me. I mean, when I was younger, I read like Hardy Boys, right? But then I remember somebody introduced me to Piers Anthony's Xanth, the world of Xanth, and there's a zillion of those books, right? But I think one of the first real books I read was one of those, and that just hooked me for life on fantasy and got me into reading and writing. And with my daughter, it's still kind of a struggle trying to find the genre that she likes. She's not a big reader, but I think if I could find something that would interest her, she would latch on a little bit more too. It's in their blood.
You have to enjoy it to want to read it. Yeah. And I think if my mom would have never come home with those Stephen King horror books, I don't know if I would have found the love of reading, because I was just thinking reading was very boring from what school is forcing.
Yeah, and I mean, it tells us something about the educational system. Like, if you want people to learn to love to read, they shouldn't be forcing books on them that a lot of people find super dry. Like we had to read. I don't know. I'm in Canada. I know you are too. We didn't have to read a lot of the same kinds of things as they do in the U.S. But I remember Shakespeare was always something that they pushed on us, right? And it's a hard read. The language is the language that everything is sort of couched in metaphors and allegory. Like you really, it's a tough thing. And like when you're trying to get something to love to read, that's, I don't think, the right way to do it. They should do some really popular fiction, as they're younger, just to get that love of reading, and then introduce some of the boring stuff to be like, okay, listen, there's some of this type and there's some of that type. But if you just start them off with that stuff, you might kill that love of reading forever.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's funny because like Shakespeare now is something that I love, but you're right. It was when you're a kid, you just don't get it.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of big words.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, there's even books sometimes if you read the wrong one in your genre. Like I think I almost wrecked my kid's love of reading by giving him the wrong fantasy. Like he was liking fantasy, and I'm like, hey, try this one. I gave him like I think it was the Belgariad series. It's this old thing from my day. Like, I liked it, but he just didn't like it. It was too dry. It took too long to get to sort of the point for him. And then, he went back to his other ones, and so all good. But like, if I had read the wrong fantasy back then, if I had read, so I remember everyone loves Lord of the Rings, right? But personally, I found the books extremely hard to get through. I just found them very, very boring. I like the story.
Were extremely hard to get through. But they were extremely hard to. I like them, but there's so much running through fields and then running through fields and then running through.
True, but they grabbed sort of like the important bits and they expanded on them. Whereas in the book, it felt like 100 pages of running through fields every chapter. And so if I had started with those, I probably would never, have that love. So yeah, it's very important to sort of make sure that, you're writing to, even your style is appropriate for your audience so that it grabs them. And you don't always know that ahead of time. But I think it sounds like, what you've done, making your personal journeys into these more storyline things, like that is a good way to grab people, so that they aren't getting their backs up of like, oh, this is a learning book or whatever. So
yeah, try to make it a little bit fun.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, you have to I mean, you have to like beat education into people sometimes, right? You have to find some way to get them to learn when they don't really realize they're learning.
Yeah.
So when you're coming up with, so like when you want to write the next one, right? So what are you doing? Are you sitting back and going, okay, I've talked about this and I've talked about this, and maybe there's do you look for sort of holes in where you haven't areas that you haven't touched on, because you're writing about these specific things, mental health and autism, right? So you want, and you're trying to keep it to what you understand, what what you've lived through. Mm-hmm. So are you trying to like look at, where are the holes and the gaps in what you've sort of talked about already, and then try to fill those in, see if there's an audience for that?
That would be a great way to do it. It's not the way I do it. Again, I am kind of a fly by the seat of my pants when it comes to writing. I mean, obviously I sit down, I really write it. But it's kind of the same way with ideas. I just wait until inspiration hits. So with my last book that just came out in December, the one that was the poetry that's kind of like the light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing. It was completely random. I was in the kitchen. My mom was in the bathroom, and I went to weigh myself because I've been not on a diet, but I've just been making healthy choices. And my mom said, "Oh, how's that diet going?" And then I was like, "No, I'm making healthy choices." She goes, "Yeah, but you guys just had a whole bunch of pizza and stuff last night." I'm like, 80-20 rule. And so she got to me, right? So I went to my room and I wrote this poem out about body image. And I went, I guess this is my next book. My next book is about the ups and downs of life, but keeping the positive side going, and how there is good in life still, even when there is some bad stuff. So I definitely did not sit down to think about it. I wasn't like, is there a hole in these stories? I was completely random and organic. That was the next story that was going to be written, that was the next book to come out. And a lot of them come out that way. Just something happens and it sparks me to go, okay, I need to share that. But yeah, actually sitting down thinking about it, that sounds like a great idea.
Well, I mean, you could still be a pantser. I think, some people, they'll at least figure out their topic and then they'll pants it. Right? But it sounds like you're just pantsing the topic too, so it's good.
Usually, yeah, I just kind of, whatever inspires me, that's the direction I go. Now, obviously I do sit down and think. So once I have that inspiration, I go, okay, but what is important within this inspiration? And so with the last book, Thoughts of a Warrior, that I was just talking about, what was important was making sure that all of the poems held at least some kind of inspiration for goodness. So even when there's some poems that came back out and it's like, wow, sometimes it's still hard, depression can still randomly hit. but there needed to be an ending of like a satisfactory, inspirational ending to each one. And then sitting down, thinking about it and plotting as best as I plot, it was also, okay, I want to showcase what is good in life as well. So each poem is actually matched with a nature photo that I took. And I really sat down and went through which picture matched the inspiration of each poem so that it got the more than just a written inspiration. It had some kind of nature component to it. So the inspiration was randomly write poems, because poems for me, I cannot just sit down and write one. It will come out not great. So it has to be when I'm in an emotional state, whether it's a good emotion, a bad emotion, whatever it is, has to be in one of those states. And then I really sat down to truly think about which order should these go in, which picture needs to go with it, so that it did still follow what I needed it to show to the audience.
Oh, you said something about how each one has to have like that satisfying, and that's to me like the most difficult problem of being a pantser is, intrinsically, even if you don't follow a formula that or a structure, that there has to be some kind of like twist or change to make things satisfying. And if you're just writing by the seat of your pants, it's often difficult to do that. How do you manage to find that thing to give it the satisfaction that a story needs?
So I think writing in the style that I write, with the nonfiction, writing my own story, it's a natural thing, because the story of life kind of throws those ups and downs at you naturally. So I am currently working on it. It's not going to be a nonfiction. This one is a suspense book, and I can't pants it. I've tried a little bit and it doesn't work, because like you were saying, I want that satisfactory kind of moment. I need that moment in the book for it to really come through. So there is a lot more plotting that has to go in. I'm still a little bit pants on it, because that's just who I am. Like, I didn't know that the character was going to get a cat, but you know what? We're going to throw a cat in there randomly. It's just what's going to happen.
With the cat traveling time.
Exactly, the cat traveling. Yeah, that would be awesome, actually, maybe. But there does have to be more plotting, because I don't want to just tell the story. I want there to be a twist. But with my nonfiction stuff, I don't have to worry about that too much, because the twist is that life is crazy.
That's a very valid point up. So I was also going to ask, when you're plotting things out, and do you have like someone in mind that you're writing to, or do you just write? Like, do you picture a particular person? Because you said your writing is very much like you're sitting down having a conversation. Do you have a face that you're imagining talking to?
I actually have a lot of trouble visualizing faces. So definitely not. But I would say it's more like I kind of visualize like I'm talking to an imaginary friend kind of thing. I can't visualize somebody, which is why in books, when I'm reading a book and they start describing what the person looks like, I usually will skip it, because I can't see it anyways. So I'm just like, let's skip, because I can't see it. But I think when I'm writing, it's more, I'm almost like journaling, I would say, for at least the first draft. It's very similar to journaling all of that story out. So it's like I'm telling myself the story, almost in that format.
Right. That's what we were saying earlier. That first draft is telling yourself the story, and then the second draft is telling it to the audience. Right.
Exactly. And I think that is my style when I'm writing it. I don't visualize a specific person, but I am kind of telling it as I'm going. And it's like, if somebody was there, this is how I would say it to them.
Right. Well, I mean, it sounds like it's working, right? Because you're hearing from the audience and they're connecting with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key, right? We're all trying to connect.
Exactly.
You can't change people if you're not connecting to them. If they don't feel anything when they read the book, there's no reason for them to say to themselves, well, I'm getting some value here, and this is something that I should implement, right? Because to them, it's just like, very, very important. So when you're thinking about how do you sort of position these books in terms of marketing, right? Because you have an idea at the point where it's done, at least who it's for, and who it can help. Where are you finding your audience?
Oh, that is the hardest part. If I could just write books and have somebody else do all that hard part, that'd be great.
You're not the first person to say that.
I think that's a common theme with authors. So a lot of it is first word of mouth to people that I know, obviously. But I go on a lot of podcasts and share my story. And through sharing my story, that's when they're like, okay, I want to know a little bit more, because obviously there's much more that goes into it than a quick 20-minute, 30-minute conversation with somebody. So I do try to go on a lot of podcasts that talk about either autism or mental health, because that way it's hitting the target market that these books are written for. And I also have my own podcast where I talk about mental health and autism, so people can, again, get that little glimpse of what I'm saying. But if they really want the story, they got to go read the book to get the rest of it. That seems to have worked out the best for me, because that's the tough part, because there are so many choices of books out there that what separates my book from somebody else really is me. Especially because I am writing nonfiction about my life, right? It really comes down to, do you want to hear my story as opposed to this other person's story?
Yeah. And I guess with nonfiction, sometimes you can find, I guess, groups where people are talking about that issue, and you can sort of approach those groups to say, here's my story about it. But often it's hard to do that. A lot of groups have self-promotion rules and stuff like that. But yeah, I think, do you ever do any like advertising, or do you strictly try to?
I a little bit do advertising, but that takes a lot of planning to think ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, it's planning, money. It's not easy. That's for sure.
Right. And again, I'm not the best at doing a whole bunch of planning, because if I do that, then I plan so much that I miss the purpose of the plan, and then I don't follow through on the plan because I'm too busy planning the plan, if that makes sense. And then, yeah, obviously money is always a big issue. So I have run a few like Facebook ads and stuff, but I find talking to people and having their audience hear it, because they've already built the audience, right? Just like for you guys, you've already built this audience of authors who want to know more about other books, and maybe they're going to find inspiration to publish their first book or something. If I find other podcasts that have already built that audience, it's just as good as going to a group. In fact, it's better, because the podcast doesn't have the rules like the group does, like you said, where it's like no advertising yourself. It's literally the purpose of most of these podcasts, even though we're not always necessarily promoting our specific book. Like on my podcast, when I have guests on, we're talking about mental health, but through talking about themselves, obviously they're promoting their work.
I mean, I think you can't help it. I mean, we've had a very nice conversation today about all sorts of things, and yes, it promotes your work because that's what you do. But you haven't been here just like selling it. You've just been not even selling yourself, just being yourself.
Right, and I think that's one of the big key things to being an author, is that self-promotion, getting yourself out there, getting yourself known. Our podcast specifically is for authors to learn about the writing craft, but you're still going to also, by extension, learn about that writer, and maybe that interests you, and maybe you want to learn more about that writer. Maybe something they said really speaks to you. But even if it doesn't, you're building connections within the community, and then so maybe somebody watching has a podcast and they reach out to you because they want you on their podcast, right? It's all that sort of thing. They all work together, right, holistically.
Yeah.
So it's not, even though a lot of authors are very they're not extroverts, right? They're very introverted. They don't necessarily want to get out there. This is one of those things we're always saying, is like, to really be successful and to promote yourself, you do kind of have to get yourself out there. You have to take a little bit of risk sometimes, and at least get to know the audience that you're trying to sell your book to.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we are approaching the top of the hour. So about we want our readers, I said our readers, our listeners, to be able to find all sorts of stuff about you. So before I ask you to tell everybody where they can find your books and stuff like that, Craig, do you have any final thoughts or questions?
No, not really. This has really been an interesting discussion about audiences. You really have to know your audience, and you have to be able to speak to them. You have to be able to reach them. You have to be able to, that's the reason you're writing books, especially with nonfiction. You want to build that connection to them. And sometimes it's a little bit harder because you have maybe less of an audience to speak to. It's much more specific. If you write a fantasy book, your fantasy book is potentially going to be relevant to all fantasy readers. But when you write a book about autism, you're only writing to people that are interested in that topic, that have a connection to that topic. So it's harder, right? And which is why you have to be much more focused in reaching that audience and making sure you hit that audience head on. So thanks for coming on and talking us through your process of doing that.
And I think one of the nice things is your authenticity comes across as well. And I think one of the keys to writing and one of the keys to making connections with people is being authentic. So yeah, it's been very enjoyable having a chat. So where can people find your books, find out more about you, and find out more about what you do?
So all of my books are on Amazon. So if you just put in Randi-Lee Bowslaugh, everything will come up. My website is rbwriting.ca. And then I am on YouTube under The Write or Die Show. And then Facebook, RB Writing, and then Instagram and TikTok is just my name, Randi-Lee Bowslaugh.
Well, that is wonderful. We will obviously put a link down to your website in the description down below. So anybody listening to this or watching this who would like to find out more, scroll down there, click on that link and go and check Randy's stuff out. And while you're down there, there's a big empty comment section. So why don't you leave a comment and let Randy know how much you have appreciated everything that she has shared with us today. And we always love reading the comments. So don't be shy about doing that. And while you're down there, there's also that subscribe button. There's that like button and there's a little bell icon you can double tap to get notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked. And of course, there will be a brand new episode of Fully Booked coming next week. So until then, cheerio.